Hello, and welcome to the Nova Economics Club podcast. I'm Eric Loyola, researcher at NEC. Today we're recording from the beautiful Portuguese Assembly of the Republic in Lisbon, and our guest is none other than Carlos Guimarães Pinto, economist, author, university professor, and currently a deputy for the Iniciativa Liberal Party within the Assembly of the Republic. Before entering Parliament, Carlos worked as a strategy consultant in telecoms and digital enterprises across more than 20 countries, completed a PhD in economics, and helped found the Mais Liberdade policy think tank, experience that sits right at the intersection of public decision-making and private expertise. He also served as the second president of the Iniciativa Liberal Party and has written extensively on economic policy throughout his career. This wide array of experiences, from hands-on consulting to the legislative arena, makes him an ideal guide to today's topic: how government should engage consultants, where they add real value, what must remain sovereign within these projects in the public policy, and how to build transparency, efficiency, and autonomy within these projects. Carlos, thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, and welcome to our parliament.
Thank you very much. Let's dive in. So to start off, a more contextual question. We see ourselves in a reality where public institutions frequently seek advice from private companies who are specialized in economic and strategy consulting. With this in mind, when should governments reach out to consultancy firms?
I think consultancy firms can really be helpful in helping out government. So, of course, there are some risks, and we can talk them in the future. But public officials, fortunately, change very often. Of course, there's always an administrative team that remains the same throughout the years. But those making the decisions, those developing the strategy, they change very often. So it can be helpful for them to have consultants that have been working with governments for very long and have all that knowledge that has been applied in other countries. As a former consultant, I know that usually if there's something that works, it's very likely that it was tried before. Somewhere in the world, someone tried that thing, and it worked. And you, as a government official, may not know everything that happened in every country in the world, which worked, didn't work, why did it work, why it didn't work. So having specialized consultants that have been doing this for many years in different geographies, it's useful both for companies and for government. Bringing best practices from other countries is always helpful for governments, and we cannot expect the governments themselves to have those type of skills or the decision makers to have that type of skills.
Perfect. And in this sense, usually in which stages of the policy cycle, so diagnosis, design, implementation, even the evaluation of the policy cycle, do consultants usually add real value?
Well, it really depends on the qualifications of the government teams, and that depends from country to country a lot. I usually just did consultancy for private firms. The few times I did with governments, I saw that there was a big difference in skills depending on geography. I don't want to speak about specific geographies, not to be fancy, but in some countries, the skill set was one type of skill set, and in other countries, another type of skill set. So in some countries, you can have government officials that have perfectly the capabilities of doing the diagnosis by themselves, doing the implementation later on by themselves, and all the support they need is on developing the strategy. That's where they need the support. That's where the value added of the consultants is. In some other countries, that we should notice that sometimes it can be the neighboring countries. So two neighboring countries in the same geography have very different skill sets within government officials. So in some other countries, that skill set doesn't exist. There's government officials, and the same thing in private companies, by the way, don't have the capability even to do the diagnosis, to collect the right data, to analyze the right data that it's needed to develop the strategy, and the implementation later on as well. So that will really depend. I would say the core of the work of any consultant is to bring best practice benchmarks from other countries to develop the strategy, to develop the guidelines, but they may need something else to do the diagnosis part and at least some support for the implementation part.
Awesome. That's a very interesting perspective. And also, in this sense, in which cases, in which situations should policies be strictly within the government and not be subsidized to a private consulting project?
It's very hard. I would say that anything that has to do with government secrets, let's say defense, would be very hard, although there are some good consultants in the defense area and they are used to keep their work confidentially, defense, security, etc. I'm not very knowledgeable of that specific type of consultant, but I know there are some consultants and there is a very strict confidence that it's the that knowledge will stay confidential. Because I was saying to you, what consultants do when developing the strategy is to bring knowledge from other countries, and that's okay when you speak about bureaucracy, when you speak about public administration, when you speak about healthcare or education. If you speak about defense, it's not
Yeah, that's a
necessarily the
different
case,
case.
right? You don't expect you know that when a consultant comes to you to do some work on healthcare, that if that works, he will take that case from Portugal and apply it in any other country. You don't expect that from a defense
Yeah,
contractor.
certainly.
You certainly hope that will not happen, that they will take your secrets or whatever and take it to another country, unless, of course, it's a country within a similar defense bloc. That can happen. That's why usually these consultants are within defense blocks, or there's NATO consultants or that can provide that type of work, but it's different. And then there is a second side to it, which is, and I've seen that in some countries, governments should not become very dependent on consultants. If there is a gap in knowledge, they should try to ensure that that gap is covered by the consultants themselves. I did that with private companies that didn't have a very good skill set within their employees, and part of my job was always to ensure that they wouldn't need so many consultants afterwards, which is a bit contradictory. But government should really pay attention to that, to make sure that if they don't have the skill set, if it's clear from the fact that they hire consultants that they don't have the skill set, that skill set is developed, and there are consultants for that as well.
Perfect. That's completely understandable. And now moving on to a slightly different topic. In most aspects of policy development and implementation, when it comes to blending the public and private sectors, a good part of the population sees that with a bit of skepticism, and a very big part of the population thinks that this shouldn't mix up. And in this sense, what is the strongest context, or even the strongest case for using private consultants in government today specifically? So, and what is the clearest red line to avoid outsourcing of sovereign decisions?
Yeah, I think there are risks, and there are risks of hiring consultants that have to do with the way that the consultants are hired. Because when you do public, I forgot the word, public purchasing, you need to do a public contest and have but in some consultant areas there are really specialized consultants that you want to have, that specific company that does this very specific thing in every country, and that makes the purchase process less transparent, and it opens gates to favoring specific people, whatever, because good consultants can be extremely expensive, and it's not like buying chairs that you say, well, I want some brown chairs, leather brown chairs, and you have 10 different companies say, I'll charge you 100, I'll charge you 90, I'll charge you 80. When it comes to consultants, they are very well paid because knowledge is very well paid, and it's very hard for people outside to scrutinize, is this company really worth the $500,000 that we pay to them to do this service? And in many cases they are worth. In some other cases they are not worth it. They are just exchanging favors. What is the big problem here? We don't know which is which, and it's very hard to scrutinize. An extremely good consultant that costs dozens of thousands of euros can be worthwhile, and it can add nothing. And for someone from the outside to scrutinize and to assess which one is which, it's extremely hard. It is. If you are within the government and you're getting the strategy, you understand which one is knowledgeable and which one is not. But if you are from outside, that's very hard to assess. So that's for me the big challenge of hiring consultants, and that's why the government should try to limit that to very specific things and develop an internal skill set, without forgetting that indeed these consultants can bring a lot of value and accelerate transformation, structural reforms that we speak a lot. These consultants can really add value to it.
Perfect. And in this context, let's put ourselves in an imaginary situation. Imagine yourself as the Prime Minister of Portugal right now. Where would you allocate private associated consultancies firms to work within a branch of the Portuguese government or public sector at this moment?
Probably, I would say healthcare. That's one of our biggest challenges right now. There are healthcare systems that work significantly better than ours, and we have a huge problem of resource allocation within healthcare and bureaucracy, public administration in general, to how to do it. There's a few success cases in other countries that we can use, and of course we can go there, investigate and whatever, but someone has already done that. There's people who have already done that have done that in many countries. Just a question of going there and getting it. I have that case at some point. This was with a private company that I went there to sell a project. I identified the need that company had and say, okay, we can do this for you. You need a change of strategy. We can do that for you. And they refused it and say, we are going to do it internally. We're going to collect the benchmarks to understand what is the best. I think we have good people, and they did have good people inside, so we can do it. After 1 year, they came to us and asked to do that similar project. Why? Because that effort that they had to do to collect the best practices, to adapt those best practices to their office, drained so many resources, human resources from the company, that the company started suffering somewhere else. And they realized, well, it's better to pay consultants knowing that we are paying consultants 4 or 5 times more than our own employees. But you also do it faster because you've been doing this forever. When you have a special project, either within a company or within a government, and you want to do it internally, many people will do that for the first time ever. They have never done it. They will have to learn on the go how to do it. If you hire a consultant that has been doing that in 20 different countries, they already know what to look for. They already know the mistakes that they can do. So it saves so much time, and the impact is so much better that it just makes sense.
Perfect. And now again, switching a little bit the topic. Sometimes a crisp expert note is everything that a ministry needs, but other times lengthy studies and very complex studies that were supposed to help on a government project with a consultancy firm, they just end up in a drawer and people never actually see them and use them for what they were contracted for. And in this sense, from your experience, do a lot of these reports actually end up in the drawer and are never used?
I've unfortunately seen that. I've seen some of those cases, even in private companies also. Yeah, that I've seen that happen. If the organizations don't have the implementation skills, so they see that's very nice. We don't want to hire consulting for the implementation. So and we don't have the skill set. So yeah, that's very nice. We'll do it eventually, but right now we have to solve an immediate problem in immediate problem, and that's really a waste. That's really a waste. And for the consultants themselves, it's very unsatisfactory because besides getting paid, of course, the consultants like to get paid, and if they get paid, it's fine. But they like to see their things being applied. At least I used to like, to enjoy the fact that the strategy that I developed is actually being implemented and it has results. Even if I'm not doing the implementation, I'm not getting paid for the implementation, you get satisfaction from the fact that you helped someone. I used to call up my former clients not to sell projects but to understand how much did your profit or revenue increase according to the project that we were doing. Did you apply this? Did you not apply? Not because I wanted to sell a follow-up project, it's because I wanted to feel some professional satisfaction that I helped those people.
For sure. And regarding this problem, do you think there's a direct solution that we could actually adopt so that less and less projects end up in the drawer? Or do you think that's just an intrinsic part of consultancy within the public sector?
There is a solution for that. Well, it's about the decision maker. Honestly, usually bad decision makers do the strategy and then don't implement it. It's to have better decision makers. I really don't have any other solution. When you speak about government, maybe have public scrutiny saying, well, you paid $2 or $3 million to develop this strategy, or euros to develop this. When I speak in consulting, I only speak about dollars. That's 2 or 3 million euros to develop this consulting project, and then nothing happened. And that scrutiny might help avoiding that in the future.
Understood.
We had a case. We had a recent case that they decided to develop, and this is public, so they decided to develop an intern chat app for the government to be a bit more secure, whatever. Of course, no one used that. They just kept on using WhatsApp, and that became public. And in fact, well, if you were not going to use it anyway, why did you even develop? Why did you spend a few million euros for that? And they should do the same for the consulting project, definitely.
And that's a direct example to this. So, a very interesting perspective.
Yeah, exactly.
And now let's talk a little bit about dependency in this context. So, repeated engagement solicited by the government and the public sector can create too much reliance on these external advisors and consultants. It's a little bit related to what we were just talking about. And, a beneficial relationship between the two sides requires the capability to transferring and applying the advice once the service is done. So we predict that at some point the relationship is going to be done and the government won't depend anymore for that specific project on private advisors. And in this sense, how can governments prevent dependency on these external advisors and consultants?
Well, it's very hard. You have to develop the internal skill set and have a HR strategy to make sure that regardless of the change within governments of the parties that lead the government, there is a team that is really stable and stays there to support whichever government is there. There's and I'm seeing more and more another way of breaking that dependency, that is a midway, which is they hire the consultants themselves. So they become public employees. They go to McKinsey or whatever, they hire them and they work for the government. There's one big challenge with that there's salary caps, very low salary caps within public officials, and any middle manager at McKinsey earns more than the minister in Portugal. And of course, you cannot ask someone to be below the minister, well below the minister, and earn more than the minister. And so in many cases, the hiring of consultants, it's a way to overcome this limitation, this salary cap limitation that there is, because it's very hard to hire very good people when you have such a salary cap. Portugal has a huge problem with, for example, IT experts, because who wants to work for the government? Any experienced IT expert for 2,000-3,000 euros when they can make that in a week in any other company. So that's a challenge that we have to avoid dependency.
Perfect, perfect. And now on a little bit more current tangent regarding AI and technocracy, all of these questions lead us to a deeper reflection into government organization and technocracy in general. So, where do you draw the boundary between democratic choice and technocratic decision making when it comes to, consultancies are more and more using AI and different technologies that could incur into potential conflicts of interest within the government? How do you see this context in general?
I'm not sure that there are conflicts of interest. There are decisions that are technocratic and should be assumed as technocratic. There are others that are ideological. So you take it at a higher level, an ideological decision. For example, let's speak about healthcare, right? Healthcare, you can have the ideological choice of I'm going to have a system that is 100% state-owned. It's a valid choice. It wouldn't be mine, but it's a valid ideological choice. If it's chosen democratically, it's completely valid. So you have that choice, that umbrella choice, and then how are we going to organize this purely state-owned healthcare system? And from that moment on, it's a technocratic decision, and you can hire consultants. How the best state-owned healthcare systems in the world were organized. Of course, you will not overcome the challenges of being state-owned, but within that choice that was taken of being purely state-owned, you can make it work better or worse. Or if you choose ideological, say, okay, we want a system in which the government only finances healthcare, all the provision of healthcare services is private, the other extreme. That's an ideological decision. And then below that, there's a level of technocracy, okay, how do we best organize this system that we have defined from an ideas perspective? And these are two different things. It's like, and many other decisions, especially taken at local level. What is the communist or the liberal way to clean a road? Mm-hmm. There is no. That's a technocratic decision. It's how a liberal or a communist decides how the route of the garbage trucks is. There is no, right?
Yeah, I mean, exactly.
You can say whether you ask private companies to do your garbage collection or you have public employees. That's an ideological decision. Then to define the route that the trucks will have, well, that has nothing to do with being socialist or liberal or whatever. So there are different levels of decision. I accept that some might be mixed. There might be some nuances in this vision, but in general, we can separate it.
Perfect. And also in this sense, the CEO of OpenAI very recently said that he's not sure how to deal with the future evolution of AI regarding political decision making, saying that he doesn't know what we should do when ChatGPT, for example, is simply better than the president or any other public servant on complex and multifaceted decision making. So that's his opinion. And then with this in mind, how do you think elected officials should use algorithmic tools or AI advisors in this case, which is increasingly the scenario within consultancy companies, without ceding accountability in general?
The accountability will always be human, regardless whether you use even if you use AI to take your decisions, you are the one taking decisions. You are the one who decided whether you're going to take AI's advice or to go another path. So the responsibility is purely human, and that has to be clear. And from that moment onwards, then AI becomes a positive addition to the decision maker, because of course you as a human being, you have a lot of limitations, memory, processing. We have a brain that's very powerful, but it has processing limitations, memory limitations that potentially AI does not have. So it's possible to do the right questions, get the answers, get different answers, and then your human decision will be the last one. but using AI to inspire you to give you alternative routes, I think it's a great idea because it adds to your brain processing abilities. I must say, and it's not the first shock that we have in that sense. I even think the internet was a shock on that sense as well. You are all too young to have lived before the internet, but the internet was one of the best things that happened to me given my skill set. And I'll tell you why. I always had a terrible memory. Always. I'm terrible with names, with faces, terrible with everything. I I was in school while we had to memorize a lot of stuff. Luckily, today the school is not so much about memorizing, but when I was in school before internet, a lot of things had to do with memory, and I was really bad at it. The moment that we started to have all the information we needed in our phones, that was the moment my life changed because I could show my biggest strengths, which is to analyze the information, being able to take the information, analyze it, and have conclusions. That was always my biggest strength. And I didn't need to memorize anymore. If I'm writing about something and I cannot remember who was the king of Portugal in the 17th century, doesn't matter anymore. I can know it in 5 seconds by using,
Certainly.
And AI will do that thing as well for, it's also about memory, it's also about storage, but about alternatives. Sometimes you are blanking. It happens to me a lot when I'm writing. I love writing. I really like writing articles, books, etc. And sometimes I blank. I just I don't know how to build a narrative from the next paragraph of this story that I'm building. And I ask, what are the possibilities that I can? Of course, in the end, what I write is my responsibility.
Yes, the final decision will always be yours.
But to unblock blank, or I think it's great. It's really great, and I don't think we should fear that at all.
Awesome, that's a very positive perspective. I feel like a lot of people are very worried about this, but in the end, we should all just look at it as a productive tool and not necessarily a source of worries.
Yeah, exactly. And there are automatic decisions. People say, but it's going to replace the most valuable thing that we do, which is to think. And that's true. It's what humans bring, right? It's the biggest thing. But there are parts of the thinking that are just boring, right? If you are a call center agent, you have a bunch of rules that you have. If a person says this, you have to say that. If the person says this, replacing this by AI, meaning you have that right away. You don't have to memorize a tree of decision. It's great. The same thing with doctors. Of course, there is a part that the doctor will have to think by himself, but there are procedures that the patient says that he has this and this symptom, and given this, you have to do this. That they always have to follow those procedures. Having a help from AI to follow procedures that are pre-existing, I think it is a good thing. Of course, there will be a point in which there will be a human decision, and that has to remain. But having AI support, I don't think it's a bad thing.
Perfect.
It will make us even stronger. It will focus our decision making on the very difficult decisions, the ones that should require more our brain power and less on the small ones that are predefined.
Awesome. And related to all of this, transparency and accountability, question regarding, public and private institutions. If hiring an external firm for advice is necessary,
contracts should align incentives with outcomes and ensure reuse of the work by the government once that project is applied. So, bad contracting practices could revert expertise into a sunk cost eventually. And when hiring is necessary, when hiring a private institution is necessary in these projects, what does a true value for money contract look like? So, pricing, deliverables, milestones.
It's very hard because in every job there are good and bad professionals, good and bad people. And I assume there are consultants that their goal with a client is to keep them engaged, for them never to be self-reliable, because then they will keep on hiring the consultant, they will keep on making money. I've known consultants that have made a whole career with one client, making sure that client was always dependent on them, and that was their whole career. I don't think that's a good consultant. It might be a millionaire. They might have earned a lot of money doing that, but I don't think that is a good consultant. And government should really be take care of that. Of course, it's not easy because many of the results that come from a consulting project are very intangible in the short term, very hard to assess in the short term. Very often, a strategy only starts to have tangible impact in 5-10 years. Actually, the biggest structural reforms usually just have impact some years down the line. You have to pay the consultant because the consultant has to pay salaries and whatever right away. You don't have you cannot wait 10 years. Okay, we will assess in 10 years we'll pay. That's not happening. But there are fees. And then even in 5-10 years or whenever the impact is felt, there are so many complexing factors that can affect that impact that it's very hard to isolate the impact of the consultant itself. I was lucky enough that most of the time my strategies were meant to be implemented within 1 or 2 years, to have impact within 1 or 2 years. In many cases, I had those success rates, and they were easily measurable because I worked a lot in finance and marketing, but it's easier to measure. But it's harder to, in other areas, it's much harder to measure, and I accept that. It's in many cases it will be a question of trust.
I'd imagine
that a consultant, you will have to trust that it's in the interest of the consultant to provide a good job, because then that government will recommend to another government that consultant, and that's the best way, is that clients speak between themselves.
And regarding transparency and accountability, are there like general rules that are implied by the government so that that are like case specific, so that there's always privacy and accountability and transparency at the same time being applied?
There has to be some level of transparency of what's being done, but I really don't know which rules. It really depends on what type of consulting. There's the types of consulting that are very straightforward, that it's just that you know exactly the object, you know exactly the goals, and in that case it's very easy to be transparent. In another one that are a bit less easy to scrutinize, the transparency should be there. I mean, let's be clear. Okay, I'm complexifying this, but at the first level, of course, the contract should be online. We should know how much was paid, what was the object of the consulting project. Of course, that type of transparency should be there regardless. Then there's another step, which is the transparency of results, and that's in many cases harder to assess.
I'd imagine. And now going to the final stretch of the podcast, public trust for the government improves when citizens can see what was bought by the state, at what price, and with which impact. In this sense, transparency should be meaningful without drowning people in bureaucracy and complicated paperwork. So, the population should be able to understand what's happening without too much work and without too much complications. With this in mind, what level of transparency should be standard? So scopes, day rates, deliverables, pricing, or should it just be something a little bit more arbitrary in this sense?
No, when it comes to consulting, of course, the scope. I have some issues with the day rates because they can be manipulated. In the end, if you are from the outside, you never know how many people are actually working on that project. Sometimes it's very hard to explain why consultants charge the daily rates that they charge, because people have no idea how come someone is getting, in many cases, I know, 2,000 euros per day. It's something. My salary is not 2,000 euros per month. How come someone is getting paid 2,000 euros per day as a consultant? And in many cases, it can be justified because behind that consultant, there's a whole team, there's a bunch of experience, there's a bunch of costs that were engaged in order for that consultant to be worth 2,000 euros. There's a support team that does research, that supports that consultant in order to do that. But then it's very hard to explain, because when you're speaking about consultants, you feel like you are paying for one person, which in most cases it's not that. So what many consulting companies do is in order to reduce that, they put everything in other the secretary. They also put there's an FTE or the research person or the person that develops the slides, and then all of a sudden the daily rates stop making any sense whatsoever. So daily rates can be there, but I think more important than that is the total cost of the project, the scope of the project, and if possible, later on, the outcomes, the results of the project should be there, taking into account that some of those results might need to be confidential.
Awesome. And now, lastly, a quick fire question for you. What would you immediately change regarding the current relationship consultancy has with the Portuguese government or political decision making in general within Portugal? So if you had the power to do this change, what would you do in this sense?
I'm not sure there is a really big need for a change right now. I at least I don't know of many cases that are very obvious of abuse either on one side or the other. I don't know to which extent this current government is using consulting companies. I know that they went to hire some former consultants that really are, I believe, interested in the public service, and that's a very interesting thing that people after some years they made enough money and they say, okay, now I'm going to try to do something for my country, and I think that is very very interesting. It would be very easy for me to just come here and criticize everything. I want to see it first, how that relationship is going to be, and then maybe have some stronger opinion about that. Sorry, I cannot answer that question probably as
no, it's completely understandable.
But I do want to first see it and then assess.
Awesome, and that's the most prudent thing to do, I'd say. Carlos, thank you very much for your insights. I'm sure that our listeners all deeply appreciate them. And this is all we have for today. Thank you for listening to the Nova Economics Club podcast. If you found this useful, please follow or subscribe and share this episode with a friend. And until next time, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.